So the one I'm going to talk about today mostly is this LLSD program that kind of originated with this particular advisory committee. Now, what LLSD is doing, I guess first off, I'll say there's LLSD and there's the LEAD program, and we kind of have borrowed from some of the concepts in the LEAD program. If we're talking about sustainable buildings, certainly I would categorize the safety of the occupants and the safety of the first responders, as well as the protection of the building. That's a sustainable feature that we need to make sure that is properly addressed in the design and ongoing operation and maintenance of any high-rise building. So we looked at the LEAD model as one type of program that would maybe parallel, or we could parallel the LLSD model with. We also have another program in the United States developed by the Building Security Council, and they have a rating system that kind of is attempting to do some of the same things that LLSD is doing. We have a little bit of overlap, but it's the same concept. And what LLSD is trying to look at are, right now we're in this debate in the US about should we be mandating additional provisions for high-rise buildings? Should we make them safer? However you might want to define what safer means. In the fire protection world, it's been my view that high-rise buildings are one of the safest structures to be in for a variety of perils or hazards, including fire. They already have a lot of redundant features, a lot of additional features that many other low-rise or mid-rise buildings just aren't going to have associated with them. So as this debate moves forward, we were kind of challenged with, should some of these provisions be made mandatory? Is there a way to bring some of these provisions in on a voluntary basis? In other words, not make them a mandate, but look at features and systems and redundancies that aren't currently required by the code. Is there a way to measure those? And is there a way to provide some incentives to a developer or a building owner that might be interested in applying them? So we kind of borrowed a little bit from the LEAD program in terms of this rating system or some type of rating system that we'll look at momentarily. But we also looked at a project that I worked on with the council back in 2001 and 2002. There were two documents we prepared, but the one of most interest is the CTBUH Building Safety Enhancement Guideline. And I'll put another plug in for Jerry Carey. She has copies of those for sale out in her booth as well, and she probably wants to lighten her load even more to go home. But that enhancement guideline was a first attempt post 9/11 to look at features that owners, designers, architects, developers might want to consider on a voluntary basis. And again, we're talking about some enhanced level of safety. What the NFPA Advisory Committee did then, they looked at that enhancement guideline and they looked at the parameters, and we kind of came to terms on about 12 parameters that we thought would be important for consideration as we move forward with this. The outcome was intended to be a checklist of sorts that could be applied on a case-by-case design basis, and with certain enhancements or certain features that weren't code mandated. These would be voluntary enhancements or voluntary upgrades, kind of going through a list of these 12 areas to see which ones you either had present or which ones you might consider adding in addition to the baseline requirements of whatever appropriate code and standard that you're utilizing. So the essence of that process then is what we would refer to as an enhanced design or a code plus design or an optimum design. Right now, codes and standards, regardless of where I am in the world, they set what we all refer to as a minimum level of performance or a minimum level of safety. So the enhancement guideline, as the name implies, would be a way to step that up a little bit. So the issues then to look at are this notion of improved safety. Now again, I would start from the standpoint of the perspective of that high-rise buildings are already inherently safe. But we've heard from some occupants, the people that are going to work in these buildings, the tenants that are going to lease the buildings. There might be some other features, some other provisions that they're interested in having in their structure, having in their building. The term then, trying to define what improved safety means, that's very subjective, and there's no easy way to quantify that in many cases. For a developer or an owner, this could be a way to attract high-profile clients, high-profile tenants into the building. If I've got a series of 50 or 80-story office structures, and they're all competing to get the best client or the best tenant in there, again, this might be an incentive for them to do a few extra things to help sell or lease the property down the road. The revenue generation, just like with LEED, there probably would be some room for some third-party certifiers out there to look at or peer review what the building design enhancement features might contain. And then maybe some of those costs are going to be passed along to the tenant in terms of the leasing rates that become applied in that building or that structure. Now, since this is an NFPA initiative, our baseline criteria is looking at the NFPA norms or the NFPA criteria. However, I don't know that there's anything that we've got restricted right now that says you couldn't adapt this to other norms or other code provisions that are out there. Well, looking at how to implement a project like this or a process like this, it certainly is not easy. First off, we're starting with this notion of safety, which is largely not quantified in the codes or standards. They set a performance level. We kind of look at the experience with that. If the experience is negative, we tend to change it. If the experience is positive, we either keep it the same or we consider backing off on it a little bit, but it's very hard to quantify some of these. So two ways to look at it then would be a compliance approach. Do I meet what the provision is in the prescriptive code or in the specification, or I can maybe get a little more advanced and do a risk assessment, and that's kind of where an LLSD type system comes in. So when we look at this notion of improved safety, we have to ask the four questions I have here, safety of what? Occupants, first responders, the building, the contents, the structure, perhaps even the surrounding environment, the surrounding properties, the surrounding structures, who, how long, and what hazards are we going to deem to be out there. Obviously, fire has been a design hazard in high-rise buildings. Since we've had high-rise buildings, obviously in the 1800s, fire was a consideration for buildings before that time, obviously. So now we ask questions about, are those hazards the same? Are they different? Are there elevated hazards, what we might call extreme events that we need to be aware of? So at this point in time, what the LLSD model is moving towards, it's looking at a risk indexing system. And in the NFPA vernacular, we would look at risk indexing to model or analyze a situation or a scenario or a group of scenarios, characterize it, and then that fourth item there, try to rate it, try to come up with a scalable function about how much of a hazard or risk do I think I have, and how many parameters or how many systems or features can I put towards it to help offset it or help make sure it's manageable. So in the typical code design world, it doesn't have the sliding scale. Currently, what we're looking at for risk indexing is, how much is there, how much protection is there, what level of safety is there, to what extent, for what hazards, and for what long. So again, try to answer those questions. When I look at the code design approaches, the prescriptive code approaches, basically, it's a yes-no. Do I meet what the code or specification is telling me to do? I meet it or I don't meet it. I don't have any good feeling. I don't have any good indication if I'm making it really safe or just safe enough. Presumably, I'm making it just safe enough because it is a minimum approach or a minimum criteria. Now, the validation piece of this, that's the biggest hurdle, if you will, to any risk indexing system. How do I develop that sliding scale? At NFPA, we're fortunate to have some experience with that. One of our major codes, called the Life Safety Code, it has a companion document which looks at alternative approaches. Now, that uses a type of risk indexing system. It's a numeric point scoring system, and it can help me determine if I've met an equivalent level of safety. That gets us close to what LLSD is trying to do, but the difference is LLSD is going to try to take that to the next level. We're not looking for an equivalent level of performance. We're looking for an optimum or, an optimum level or a beyond minimum level of performance for my building systems or my building features. Now, the implementation factor of this comes about in a couple of different ways, and I think this is the first thing that kind of triggered the concept or the idea from the advisory committee that I briefly described. First off, their mindset is, post 9/11, we need to look at other hazards. Now the question becomes, we can look at them, but do we make that a mandate for all building designs? Do we make that a mandate for all high-rise building designs? Or do we kind of leave that up to the individual project to determine what it is? So in our vernacular, an extreme hazard event we would define as an incident that makes demands on a building, a system, the building occupants that go well beyond the usual code parameters that are imposed, or the usual design parameters that are imposed by the code on that type of building and on that type of occupancy. And that also extends to the code, the standard, and also what good design and good professional practice is. It isn't every day that you get a developer or an owner of one of these high-rise structures that wants to go in excess of what those minimums are. Now this week we've heard a couple of great examples of where that's exactly what the owners and developers wanted to do. We've had examples of that on some of the projects in Chicago and some of the projects in New York City in recent years, that everybody knows what that minimum floor is, but they're willing to put in some other features and some other elements. So here are the levels of safety. We have the expectation of what the code is going to mandate, and then we have a way to try to optimize that, put in more than what the code's going to require. Now, again, what we want to try to do with LLSD is try to come up with ways to have incentives. We want to look at some ideas and some concepts that might make this a little more attractive rather than just putting on more layers of safety. We want to try to show what the returns are, what the gains are, and then we'll talk briefly about maybe a couple of incentives that might be considered. The other difficulty is looking at this notion of different levels of safety. Now in the U.S., because of the litigious nature of our society, organizations like NFPA have to be very careful with that. We can't have one requirement over here that says to do A, B, and C, and then a different requirement over here that says to do D, E, and F if you want better performance. So this is a very delicate issue for the U.S. code development organizations as well. So that will be, that's another issue that we are taking a very close look at. Now, as I mentioned, when our advisory committee looked at the CTBUH guideline, looked at all the issues that the guideline had, they settled on these 12 items, and these 12 items are discussed briefly in the paper that's in the proceedings. And in essence, what the indexing values would do would be to take, a parameter. It would take item 4.0 maybe on elevators. And right now we have no provision that gives any credit for the elevators. 2 NFPA codes are going to be revised this summer to actually look at and allow use of elevators for occupant egress purposes, and that's what Richard Bukowski is going to talk about in a few moments. So the risk indexing process then is going to look at what the base performance is of the code, and again, these are just relative values shown here. It meets the code, and then if I have an enhancement, I exceed the code by some amount, some percentage maybe, or some value on that scalable indexing system that we talked about. What those numbers are, how far apart those graphs or those curves are going to be, that's a work in progress right now. Now the enhancement guideline, these are a couple of pages out of it. Again, difficult to read probably from the back of the room, but it gives you an idea of what the council was thinking about when we developed these back in 2001 and 2002. Again, just redundancies, additional features, redundant water supplies, backup emergency power supplies, and so on. So a number of different issues that we looked at. Now these draft checklists, this is a very early version of what one of the members on our advisory committee had put together. And these, we show these breakdowns. Again, the paper shows the breakdowns for a couple of the major categories. But if I, if I look at parameter 5.0 on stairs and enclosures, again, you notice we don't, by and large, we don't have these columns filled in because we haven't even gotten to that point yet of doing an expert panel or a Delphi committee to try to determine what those numbers might be. But stairs and enclosures, if you have minimum physical separations between stairs, there's some plus points there. Codes have provisions for separation of those stairs, but now we start talking about some things that are going to go well beyond what the code provision is looking for. So those are the types of issues that our draft checklist is looking at, and again, same thing on this slide as well, continuing right down through those 12 main parameters. Next issue then, looking to try to identify the stakeholders. We've recently identified them, because this is a very active project within NFPA and within the NFPA Fire Protection Research Foundation. So again, the stakeholders you see here are pretty much the same groups that you've heard about the previous 2.5 days. We probably have one that hasn't been mentioned, and that's the first responders. These systems can also help them with their role as they come in to mitigate a situation or help the occupants, whatever the case might be. And again, I talked about liability briefly. When we start to develop these multiple levels in the U.S., we have a wonderful Congress. It's always passing laws. Some which are good, some which aren't so good maybe, but they did pass this thing called the Safety Act in 2002, and that does have the potential to provide protection to designers and architects and engineers and probably building owners that do come up with some of these enhancements. The purpose of the Safety Act was to help foster some emerging or new technologies to look at some of these design issues a little bit differently. And then when we look at some characteristics, a comparison between the LEAD program and LLSD, we look at motivation of the building owner, designer motivation, public optics, and so on. We see that we can start to fill some of these pieces in, at least in these categories. But again, one of the difficult ones might be cost recovery. In a LEED certified building, you can probably look at the utility bills, the heating, the cooling costs, the lighting costs, and you have some real numbers to work with. On the enhancement guideline side that we're dealing with, we said here, low cost recovery to building owner. What if we put all these enhancements in and all these features, assuming some horrible thing's going to happen, the horrible thing never happens? Is that so the cost benefit is going to be another item that will have to be weighed very carefully, I think, as we go through each one of these. So kind of in conclusion and moving forward, our research foundation, as I mentioned, they've taken a very active role with this. It's now in their hands to look at some of the ideas and some of the notions. How do we go about setting up what these indexing values are? I mentioned Delphi panels. We might have a special expert panel that's going to try to get together and collaborate to come up with these relative scores and see if we can move this to the next level. So we also, I think, we've talked about doing this either just as NFPA or in partnership. Anthony Wood was at one of our advisory committee meetings back in July in Chicago, and he knows we're moving forward with this, so we might see some additional council involvement in this as we move on. So thank you very much for your time today, and look forward to talking to you later.